Welcome to the On-Premise IT Roundtable podcast, the only show that dares to be both on topic, in other words, on-premise, and on location, in other words, on-premises. Each time we meet, we bring together IT luminaries to discuss a single concept. In this episode, we're discussing failed startups. Did they really stink, or were they just ahead of their time? Before we begin, let's quickly meet who's on the panel today.
Mark May at Sensi Storage on Twitters. I'm apparently an IT luminary, so I know that now. Thank you very much.
Howard Marks, you can find me at Deep Storage Net on the Twitters, and I'm an independent storage analyst and general bon vivant.
Keith Townsend, you can find me. I don't even know what that word means.
Yeah. That's a hitting word.
You are definitely a bon vivant.
That's a hitting word.
Keith Townsend at CTO Advisor on Twitter, Principal Advisor, the CTO Advisor.
All right, so we three kings have been around. Sorry, there's actually four of us, but that worked better. We've been around this industry a while. We've seen some companies come and go. And it's always one of those things that you look at and you think, what happened there? You know, was this company, well, did they have a bad idea? Was it bad execution? Or maybe they just came out at the wrong time. Maybe they were just ahead of their time. How do you answer that? How would we know if a company was just bad or just early? Howard, what do you think?
Well, I mean, you have to look at what happens after. The problem with being early is you have to educate the market. And we talk about first mover advantage, but I think there's a big first mover disadvantage. You have to spend a lot of market. If you are the first guy who has an all-flash array or an all-PCIe switched array or any other completely, if you define a category, first you have to educate people about why they need something in that category. And then the second guy who comes along gets to leverage all the money you spent on marketing. He just has to sell why yours, not the other guys.
Yeah, there's a common theme in a lot of non-enterprise IT shops that you want to be a close second. You want somebody else to carve out and create that market for you, then you want to hop in and capitalize on all their hard work.
Right.
I think for me, Violin's a good example there.
Yeah, so we see this even in the consumer space. No one will ever catch up with Nokia and cell phones. But Nokia had immense success early on.
If this computer company thinks they can just walk in here and
become a cell phone company.
Yes.
But I think that secondary look is great. You can look at what the market leader does and either do it better or take advantage of where there's missteps or missed opportunities.
Right. And so, I mean, if we go way back in history, Auspex invented the NAS market. And nobody has heard of Auspex in a long time.
Honestly, I would go with 3Com, the 3 server, but I will give it to you.
The 3 server was not a file server, it was a disk server, but that's a whole nother story. It actually looked a lot more like a SAN. But Auspex came up and popularized the concept of the NAS as opposed to the file server that Novell was pitching, which was limited in power because it was an x86 when it wasn't an x86, it was just an 86. But more recently, the best example of they were just too early is DSSD.
Can we consider DSSD itself a failure? They made something, had a good exit strategy.
Well, no, DSSD.
We got to separate the product from the company.
So that's true. That was not a failure.
Right.
So I don't know. Is it a failure? Our good friends that got acquired by Nutanix. Did they fail?
Pernix Data.
Did they fail, or was that a success? That wasn't successful.
Well, let's just stop looking at the industry through the eyes of the venture capitalist.
Okay, that's fair.
For DSSD, the people who put money in at the beginning had a good exit. The product never sold to anyone, and therefore the company was a failure, even though the VCs may have succeeded.
Well, and then
Pernix Data, nobody made money. Nutanix picked up Pernix Data because they wanted Satyam and his team, and they paid a bag of magic beans for it.
But back to Howard's rule. Looking at those companies, your metric was looking at them after the fact. Are other companies now coming in to do that thing successfully?
Right, and go ahead.
So DSSD definitely, right? They built something that there was no standard around, and then people are building a standard
And
around
now
that,
all the hottest
capitalizing
storage
on that.
companies.
Exactly.
The DSSD story is really very simple. Those guys, Jeff Botwin and Andy Bechtelsheim in that group, started working on let's do ultra low latency all flash so early that they had to build hardware.
Yep.
And they had to spend a huge amount of R&D money and time building the hardware to do the switched PCIe to talk to their own SSDs. And during that 5-year period, NVMe came around, and then NVMe over Fabrics came around, and the x86 processors got faster, and more of the things we needed from the processor got put into microcode. So by the time DSSD came to market, Accelero and E8 and Aperion could deliver the same level of performance. Okay, maybe it was 30 microseconds of latency into the SSD, and DSSD could be 20, but close enough that it was the same thing, with a bill of materials cost a quarter what a DSSD cost, and that's assuming that you throw away all the R&D that went into building that. So
Okay, so do we have a consensus? DSSD?
too early.
Too early. Big red stamp.
Ahead of their time. Okay.
And a class of too earlys that we've seen several times. We built this company based on the fact we could spin this ASIC to solve this problem, and by the time we got that ASIC spun in generation 2 and it actually worked, you could do it in software just as well. And we're going to see that more and more. The advantages of ASICs have just shrunk dramatically.
So who else?
Well, violin memory is a different case.
And I would take that discussion because, to me, so Violin's big idea was the solid state array.
Right. And
But they came to market before there was Flash.
yes.
Oops.
But when you talk about violin, there's violin and TMS. And they were, TMS was actually out first. And they were neck and neck. And I will argue about whether violin had an all-flash array. Violin, for me, fit into its own category, the rack mount SSD.
Yeah, but Violin had a lot of time to pivot.
Violin failed.
They
at
failed
the pivot.
to pivot, exactly.
So they
The
early
real problem.
success, no doubt. They went public, so
Right.
that by the financial perspective is a success. So they had the resources to pivot. For whatever reason, the business model didn't support pivoting. Speaking of pivoting, I'm on a panel with three storage guys. Let's talk about something that's not a storage.
Well,
company.
I think we need to label Violin first. I think they just failed to pivot.
Yeah.
Yeah, they failed to
pivot.
The market for the rack mount SST dried up
Yeah.
when SolidFire and Pure came out with similar performance with deduplication and snapshot.
So Violin
application.
should have been able to. They weren't too early on the
They
technology.
weren't too early.
I think they made bad technical decisions that prevented them from pivoting.
Yep.
Yes.
And being bought by NetApp, EMC, etc. So
So is this another rule for the rubric of too early? So some companies are clearly too early, and you can identify it because shortly afterward, it's where the market goes, and oops. Other companies are so too early that they could have pivoted, they could have adapted, they could have kept up, and they didn't.
Well, I think that's that early success that gives them the ability to pivot.
Well, and sometimes the early success leads to hubris.
Yes.
And you think that you don't have to pivot.
well,
When
innovator's
you-
dilemma. Nokia, we talked about Nokia.
Right.
They just chose the wrong platform to build their smartphone on, or they waited too late for the smartphone.
They assumed
dumb
everybody-
phone, market. They owned the feature phone piece, and then they just completely missed smartphone.
Yeah, they missed the idea that everyone would have a smartphone. They thought that
Right.
many people would have smartphones and many people would not. And because, of course, they were in the smartphone market too, they just didn't realize
they were
that
in
it
the-
was going to be for everyone, not just for
They were in the
elites.
clever phone market and wasn't really quite smart.
N95 was pretty smart.
There's a bunch of companies built over this whole, let's make private cloud easy concept, which is not a new concept to do. Private cloud in a box. We had a whole segment of OpenStack in a box companies that went out of business, and now we're seeing another wave of OpenStack in a box type of companies come to market.
Something in a box.
Yeah, something in a box, whether it's OpenStack or
cloud in
private
a
cloud.
box.
Right.
It is cloud in a box. Is cloud too complex to be put in a box? Is that too early or just a bad model?
I think it's a bad model. I think cloud, the cloud in a box and object storage have the same problem, that they don't make sense until you reach a certain scale. Having a cloud in the box because you have one internal customer who wants to run 30 VMs, you have to buy the whole box. And really, when we talk about box, we're talking about a rack-sized box.
So we can
And
pick,
when we talk about object
Let's
storage,
pick somebody.
so
well, if you
we were trying to pick companies that failed. What was the big OpenStack play that had a ton of investment?
Mirantis,
Mirantis. No, Mirantis is still around.
they're still around.
So there was one before that was they delivered a managed cloud in a box.
Meanwhile, our listeners are yelling at their phones.
We know what the company is, but let's not pick on that. Let's just generically say almost every major of the big three
Right.
enterprise IT companies had a cloud in a box strategy.
Yes.
Only one of them continued to have a cloud in a box strategy. Is that just a failed model? I mean, these are not small boxes either. We're talking about
No, and I think
tier one storage arrays, blah blah.
And I think that's part of the problem, because when you buy cloud in a box, we're talking about a $3 to $5 million buy for the box, and people don't jump into cloud having enough workloads to justify $3 to $5 million worth of hardware on day one. If they start moving things into AWS, they can spend thousands of dollars and then tens of thousands of dollars and then hundreds of thousands of dollars. And by year 4, the cloud in the box probably makes sense.
So going from that, though, back to the premise of too early versus bad idea, are you saying that some things are inherently never going to be on time because it just takes too long to do it, and so they have to be a bad idea by definition?
Yes. And
Wow.
I think that, the cloud in a box is one of those, that you have to bootstrap to the point where you don't want to buy it all at once.
Are you arguing that the scale isn't there to do cloud in a box because you can't buy it small enough?
Because a lot of HCI vendors do cloud in a box.
Well, if I could buy 4 x86 nodes, so now we're talking $100,000. That was a full cloud in a box, ran OpenStack, did the whole thing. That would be a lot more accessible than if I have to buy what is essentially a large size V-block with OpenStack on it.
Yeah, I'm not buying that as a
Yeah, I disagree.
yeah.
So I mean, let's talk about.
We're
another
drifting off the premise
Yes.
here.
It
Let's
happens.
get back on premise.
Yeah. So since you're not a storage guy, I'm going to bring up another one just because. What about Coho?
You know what, Coho?
We all love them.
So maybe this is another potential. So you've got suck, you've got too early.
And you've got 2 different.
Maybe we've got too different.
Two different or wrong market segment?
No, I think they didn't have the right application. I think where their premise is correct. We're going to, we're here at Cisco, right?
Yeah.
Or Tech Field Day, and the networking. We're seeing message buses as part of the network stack. The ideal of having services advertised over the network as part of an integrated piece of the network makes computer science sense in my argument.
Yeah, but
The storage application of it, I think that's an abstraction that the industry will adopt over time. But is it a standalone product? Or enough to build a product upon?
Is VM-centric network-based storage a thing, a product? Obviously, it's a thing. But
Well, I think part of the problem with Coho was the storage guys ended up would have to tell the network guys, and we're bringing in this switch and connect it for us.
Right.
Yes.
And so there was a big political problem there because it wasn't a storage product the storage guys could own completely. It included the network piece, and now I have to get consensus between the tree-hugging, Birkenstock-wearing and the incredibly paranoid, and that's difficult.
Which
So
to me,
on
that
premise, is there anybody like Coho that we're saying, you know what? Obviously, if Coho would have done that at this time, same thing at this time, they'd be successful.
I think
too
if they
early or bad
pivoted
idea?
to the user space, they might have been successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of things they could have done,
But they didn't.
no,
So,
So bad idea.
and well,
I think in the root of it,
too different.
yes, that which too different is bad. I mean,
Yeah. And and
I
there
don't
are
like saying it.
and there are some vendors today who have solutions that are very interesting and very appealing from a theoretical point of view,
Right.
but that are just too different, and I don't know if the market's going to pick up on it. 6 years ago, I thought server-side caching was a great idea, and Pernix and 7 other companies were pushing that.
So Pernix is another one then, right? We haven't really talked about them. Where do they stand on the premise?
Well, I think if we're going to say they're too early, there has to be someone still doing that. And
There are people still in the standalone kind of caching.
Sort of.
Well,
and you're seeing
Infinio
is
that have been going out of business.
struggling along.
Well, and you're seeing like Datrium, which does server-side caching, back-ended by a
but that's
very
all.
specific
But that's all.
product.
But that's
It's a complete product,
complete product.
not a pinpoint solution.
and
So is that a feature, not a product?
right, exactly. That's actually
I think actually that the proper thing to have happened, which didn't, is for the platform people, Microsoft and VMware, to have built decent caching into the operating system hypervisor.
So a feature.
And it was much more a feature than a
Yep.
product, because it was doing it yourself with a Pernix data or a FlashSoft, which still exists, meant I had to pick 4 parts and I have to put them together and I have to engineer it. And then when something goes wrong, the vendors of all 4 parts are just going to point fingers at each other.
So, to sum up, certainly some companies are too early.
Yes.
You can spot them because just after they go bust, or while they're still sliding down the hill, new competitors with basically the same idea spring up, and they're successful. Some companies are in the wrong market, or developing a feature and not a product.
Right.
Some companies just don't adapt as the market changes, or perhaps it takes too long to implement what they're doing, and so they can never be on time with it. And, well, I suppose some just stink. I guess time will tell, looking at the companies around in the industry now, which these are. Thank you for listening to the On-Premise IT Roundtable podcast. If you enjoyed this discussion, remember to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, since that really helps our visibility. Also, please share the show with your friends, especially if it will drive them crazy to see somebody say on-premise instead of on-premises. This podcast was brought to you by GestaltIT.com, your home for IT coverage from across the enterprise. For show notes and more, go to GestaltIT.com/podcast. I'm Stephen Foskett. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.